The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. A newly opened channel of direct communication between Barack Obama and Raul Castro last December marked an historical moment in US Cuban relations. While a generational change among both Cubans and Cuban Americans has helped create political space for a thaw, significant obstacles remain. The White House can take some steps to modify U.S. policy towards Havana, but the most significant issues, notably the embargo and immigration policy, remain in the hands of Congress, where there is considerably less enthusiasm for change. To help us explore the current state of U.S.-Cuban relations and offer some thoughts on where we might be headed, we're joined by two seasoned Cuba watchers. Raul Galvan is a native of Cuba who came to the U.S. as a child. He holds a Ph.D. in global history. His academic research focuses on migration and the Cuban diaspora. He also serves as manager of program production at Milwaukee Public Television. Michael Martin serves as adjunct professor in the Department of Urban Planning and lecturer at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at UWM. Following his first trip to Havana in 2003, he's returned on numerous occasions to lead university study abroad programs. Well, welcome both of you.
Thank you, Doug.
Well, I'm wondering if we could just start with some sense of what did happen and what didn't happen last December in the announcement.
Well, I think the biggest thing that didn't happen is open up the island for unlimited tourism, as many people, I think, are under the impression. I think it was an initial step. It was an important step. It was the first really serious conversations between two heads of state of both countries in a long time. And I think it served as the first step to hopefully what will be many changes. And it offered some families their family members back in the way of Mr. Gross and the Cuban Five and the 20 some odd other prisoners who were released.
So that was one high-profile part of the deal. What some people have characterized as the spy swap. We gave them some people, and we've got one of ours back. And you, as we mentioned at the outset, do a lot of travel under the old system. It was a bit more restrictive. Talk a little bit about what's involved right now for sort of the sanctioned U.S. travel to Cuba.
Well, currently, I suppose the new system is in place, so it's not the new system anymore. But the old system was really limited to educational travel for the normal UW student and normal UW folks. And you have to go through a licensed traveler who is sanctioned by the State Department, and Cuban officials need to have access to that too. So every one of these steps forward, as much as we'd like to think that it is our Cuban Thaw, there's a Cuban component to it too, which hasn't really changed from our perspective too much. They're still interested in tourism and still interested in tourism dollars, but there's still the same issues on the island as it relates to tourism.
So what about the idea of the goal being normalization of diplomatic relations? Where are we now? Are there any State Department officials who are now resident in Havana?
Well, I don't think they're resident in Havana. The intersection includes a lot of State Department people. But I think in the last 3 months, March, February, and January, there's been a number of meetings between Roberta Jacobson from the State Department and Josefina Vidal from the Cuban Foreign Ministry. Oddly enough, Josefina Vidal was at the Cuban intersection in D.C. with her husband, who was a consular official, and who was actually thrown out of Washington in one of the reciprocating actions that the government took a while back. And Josefina, his wife, actually went back to Cuba with him. So There's been a series of meetings. I think there's going to be plenty more. And I think the goal is that by April 10th or 11th, about the time this show airs, there's going to be a meeting of actually Raul and Obama at the Latin American Summit in Panama, I believe. So there's been a lot more conversation than there's ever been.
So, at the executive level, obviously, President Obama spoke to the embargo and said, clearly it hadn't worked and it was outdated and the policy needs major overhaul. But we've seen considerable pushback against those sentiments in Congress. Got a quote here by Senator Menendez, who says that this action is, quote, compromised a bedrock U.S. value and wrongly rewarded a totalitarian regime. So where are we at on well, and actually it's somewhat bipartisan that there are people who are skeptics on both sides of the aisle. So what drives that? I mean, do you think this is a genuine ideological position, or is it, just more domestic electoral politics?
I think that's very hard to determine. I think that there's support on both sides, and most of that support, at least what I've seen, is directly tied to Cuban Americans that are here. But there's also support on the other side, on both sides. I think Jeff Flake, the senator from Arizona, has come out. And I think as time wears on that we're going to see the rhetoric get a little less intense, and that the normal interests that are faced by U.S. senators and U.S. congressmen, mostly economic, will show through, and less of the Cuban American experience is going to be part of the decision making.
Well, and what about that? I mean, in the old days, the pre-revolutionary days of the Batista regime, the economic interests on the part of U.S. corporations in Cuba were, of course, enormous, and there presumably are people who are very anxious to get back in that game too. I mean, do you have any sense of sort of where the corporate community comes down on the issue?
Well, I think that's one of the undiscussed issues that hasn't really surfaced in the last 3 months, in the last 90 days. I'm sure that there's going to be discussions on the part of, Esso Standard Oil, or Standard Oil Company, who lost 3 refineries, as well as a vast amount of people who lost real estate, Sugar Holdings, et cetera, et cetera. But I think these are problems which have precedents in Eastern Europe, and I think can be overcome. Because remember that Cuba also feels that it's been harmed because of the embargo. So, when the conversations begin, I'm sure the Cubans are going to bring out their ledgers and say, well, yes, Mr. American industrialist, you've lost X, but here's what we've lost. And there's going to have to be a commission, or there's going to have to be some reckoning along the way.
Well, make no mistake that American corporate interests are already in Cuba. The biggest importer of food in Cuba is the United States. Mm-hmm. I always like to tell the story of being at a restaurant in Cuba and seeing Tabasco sauce on the table. Now, Tabasco is not a multinational corporation. It's made at one factory in Louisiana, so obviously there is trade. And interests already there. Again, those things that aren't discussed already.
Cuba imports its biggest amount of rice from the U.S.
I think the U.S. is the 5th largest trading partner right now, or something like that.
And first in food.
Yeah. Well, and there are already things just since December that have changed. The MasterCard, for example, is no longer blocking transactions that take place in Cuba, right? And
in the recent last couple of weeks, Netflix has announced that it plans to open up shop in Cuba. Amazon, whose CEO has a Cuban stepfather, Bezos, is opening up business in Cuba. I think just this week they signed Texa, the Cuban telephone company, signed an agreement with an American company to provide direct telephone service.
Right, because previously you had to route those calls to a third country, right?
Yeah, in essence. But in this telephone, I believe it's IDC, is already planning to provide internet service in Cuba. So there, as Michael says, there's already a base for this, and American airline planes have been landing in Cuba for like the last decade, and chartered by travel operators. So it's not going to be something that's brand new.
But corporate America is going to have a rude awakening when they start trying to do business in Havana for simple issues of businessman accommodations. Obviously, the lack of internet in the year 2015 is a major issue on the island.
But how much of that is a function of the embargo? How quickly could that infrastructure change, do you think?
Well, remember that the embargo only holds for the U.S.
Right.
All right. So Cuba's had trading partners, all over the world. And I've seen things in Cuba for the first time that I have not seen in the U.S. Like independent modular air conditioners I first saw in Cuba before I ever saw them in the U.S. So I think it may become somewhat easier for the Cubans to obtain some goods, seeing as we're like right across the Florida Straits. But it's not that they haven't had a chance to obtain them before.
Right. Just simply having access to the internet is only part of the equation. It is whether or not the current government is going to want that to happen.
Well, do you have any sense of you bring up a good point. There are other people who have been working very successfully and happily for a long time. The sort of re-entrance in a less restrictive way of U.S. corporate interest in Cuba cannot be good news for some of their current trading partners, right? I mean, if I'm a Canadian company, do I want to see the U.S. in?
I would imagine not. I would imagine not. It'd be undue competition. But you gotta remember, and this is what I think about a lot. The Cuban market, 11 point odd million people. Earnings, in comparison to the U.S., minuscule. Minuscule. How big a force that market, if you will become, I would imagine has to be, consistent with jobs or better paying jobs, unless the Cuban people have more to spend. The market will be insignificant because the Cubans just won't be able to spend on stuff.
Well, I think Raul's hit on the most important point as it relates to the economics of what's going on the island. The average Cuban makes somewhere in the neighborhood of $35 a month, and really depends on either remittances or the two-tiered financial system they have in Cuba, which is really based on the dollar. Unless those things change, the average Cuban just doesn't have spare money to buy anything. It's not a consumer society. It's one of those first things when you get off the plane that you realize that there's no neon, that the only billboards are pro-revolutionary. So it really is not a consumer economy at this point.
Well, great. Well, let's talk a little bit about one of the other thorny issues, and that's the current state of immigration policy in this country. But first, we'll take a short break. We'll be right back.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking about the Cuban Thaw with Raul Galvan and Michael Martin. Well, one of the issues that ultimately will have to be resolved is U.S. immigration policy with respect to Cuba. And it's got a very fanciful name, the wet foot, dry foot policy. Explain what that is.
I think in brief, if you touch foot into the United States, you're in. If you get interceded in the water, you get sent back. In brief, that's it.
And what is the origins of that policy? I mean, it's unique, is it not? I mean, there aren't any other places you can come from where the wetness or dryness of your foot matters much.
Well, I think Cuban immigration policy since 1959 has really been based on a series of reactions and having to deal with issues. The Bolseros in the 90s, the Marielitos in the 80s, even the beginnings of it are special. And putting that historical context in place, I think, is how we understand immigration in the past. The future is going to be very different. Anything that requires some sort of act of Congress or change of law is going to be difficult in Washington. Getting a budget is difficult in Washington. It's
a relic of the Cold War. It was a sign of the Americans saying to Cuba, hey, you are so bad, your way of doing things are so bad that everyone wants to leave, and we'll welcome them in.
Well, and needless to say, it's a policy that is not met with much enthusiasm by the Cuban government, right? Mm-hmm. So, well, let's talk about this issue of the generational aspect of it. I mean, Raul, maybe you're in a good perspective personally to look at this. Striding both generations, as you do, do you think there is a difference in the way older Cuban Americans and younger Cuban Americans see this issue?
Very, very much so. I think the generation which is typically referred to as the historic exiles, my mom and her friends, if there are still anyone who are vehemently opposed to doing business with the Castro regime, it's them. But I'm finding, at least anecdotally, from hanging around Miami frequently, I talk to my mom's friends, etc., and I find that they have a higher degree of Cuba fatigue than most everybody else's, and really don't care what happens anymore. Although they won't hesitate to tell you what they think of the bearded one. But I think my generation, and even more the generation below me of my kids, the folks who are coming from Cuba right now because of mostly economic reasons, are, in fact, the established Cubans in Miami will tell you, all they want to do is come over here and get their papers and a job so they can start going back and forth and back and forth. So, I think the degree of stridency towards the Castro regime, I think, is inversely proportional to age.
Oh, I think it also plays out in electoral politics. One of the first things I do after every two-year election is to look at the exit polling at the Miami Herald, is it? Yeah. To see exactly where Cubans are. And it's about 50-50 right now as it relates to the two parties.
If not a majority.
Democratic.
Yep.
And as Florida changes in its electoral status, there may be more room, but we all know Florida has played a significant role. And that with the amount of money in politics nowadays, nobody takes a chance. And it's hard to see that until the Golden Exiles are gone, that there's going to be a thawing of that age group. But obviously younger folks, the Golden Exiles Havana is not the Havana of today.
So if I'm just a cynical Florida politician, is the smart play to take this strident role, or is my constituency that would be receptive to that position not significant any longer? At what point does that shift?
I think in the last gubernatorial elections, one of the candidates expressed a nonchalant reference to traveling to Cuba, and did not get punished for it electorally. So I think Obama won Florida without, I think, the support of the Cubans. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe with some support of the Cubans, but he won
Puerto
handily.
Ricans definitely
exactly,
helped.
And he won handily. So I think that that's becoming less and less of an issue.
So what about looking at the other side of the strait, is there a generational aspect to this for Cubans?
I was in Cuba 2 months ago, and I asked many different types of people, is there anybody who has an issue with what is playing out now? And nobody said that they had an issue. I think that average folks who are concerned with just feeding their families see the embargo as a problem. I think intellectuals see that the current government has used the embargo to blame all problems that have happened in Cuba on the United States. And so there's no love of any of the Cold War policies on the island.
The blogger Yoani Sanchez has written a couple of really nice pieces, just marveling at how, before the billboards might say Yankee go home, and she says she's sure that pretty soon they'll be saying Yankee welcome.
Right.
So
Yankee dollars are definitely welcome. I've traveled all over Latin America, and in the early part of the 2000s, it was amazing. It was the only place in Latin America you could spend $1.
Well, given sort of the relationship between the two nations in the Batista era, is there any fear on the part, particularly of, I guess, sort of that revolutionary generation, of sort of a recolonization? Like, oh, the Yankees are back, and look what's going to happen?
I didn't get that much of a sense. I think, though, that there is, as opposed to being anti-Yankee, that there's pro-Cuba. Cubans are extremely proud of what has happened on the island. They're extremely proud of their education, their services. They're extremely proud of health care. But things do need to change. Things need to open up. Same hand gestures need to open up. And the internet is really the focus that I've seen of most of them, is where the rest of the world can get online and find ideas. It's still extremely difficult in Cuba.
Well, the sort of bigger context has changed, not necessarily in the people's favor. I mean, the two big clients, the Russians and later the Venezuelans, have their own problems these days, which of course can translate into at least economic problems for Cuba. So talk a little bit about sort of how the economy is evolving in the face of that. I mean, a little bit, particularly about the private sector activity that's going on these days.
Well, I think the private sector activity is, again, in the big picture, it's not that different than it was before. It's definitely an expansion of what they refer to as cuentapropismo, or self-employment. But we're still a ways away from an American entrepreneur coming on the island and opening a factory, vis-a-vis the Mexican example along the border of the U.S.
There'll be no Cuban maquiladoras.
No maquiladoras, exactly, thankfully.
Well, but I think there is something, even in the times that I've been there, the tourist level, for lack of a better term, MAPA businesses are really taking off. And where if you would go to Cuba in 2000 or so, trying to get a decent meal was an issue. Now there are a whole lot of extremely good restaurants that cater to the tourist crowd, and a lot of them are American tourists. And it's interesting to see that the MAPA corner business, the heart of how neighborhood works in our country, is really where most of the economic activity that's changing on the island is happening.
Well, we've got just a couple minutes left. I'm wondering if you could just look forward. I mean, there's a bit of a geriatric component to the current regime. What happens next? There aren't any more junior Castros to take Raul's place. So what can we look forward to?
Actually, there is a junior Castro. There's an Alejandro Castro who's one of Raul's sons, who some people have paid some attention to, but in reality, there is no junior Castros. And looking ahead, I suffer from some of that Cuban fatigue myself. So I quit making predictions a long, long time ago. But my hopeful goal, my big opening will be when, I can get my family together, all my kids and my grandsons and granddaughter, and say, hey, we're going to Cuba on summer vacation, or we're going to Cuba on spring break, without a license, without having to talk to Common Ground or people-to-people group, and just buy a ticket on American Airlines or whatever, or take the ferry for Marathon, which is coming in December.
Well, there's evolution and there's revolution. And I think currently we can look, revolution happens all over the world, and obviously that would be a game changer if there was a regime change. But also we have issues that the way the Soviet Union fell left everybody in a quandary, and we're seeing that the ghosts of the previous regime coming back now. It's really hard to understand where things will go.
Well,
but
we're going to have to leave it at that. Raul Galvan, Michael Martin, thank you so much. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,